I'll come back.
Very much, Mr Deputy Speaker. It's always a pleasure to follow the honourable gentleman, the Chair of the Defence Select Committee. Despite agreeing with almost none of what he had to say, he is always unfailingly courteous to, I know, my honourable friend from Western Berkshire on that committee, and it's always a pleasure to hear what he has to say. I should also start, Mr Deputy Speaker, as the Secretary did himself, say to send our best wishes to those who are based at Barrow, given the bomb scare there this afternoon. Despite our disagreement that I'm sure we will get into this afternoon, the honourable gentleman from Barrow should be under no illusion that folk there do have the best wishes of the Scottish National Party. As do, Mr Deputy Speaker, those who serve in the armed forces, both those who serve on the front line in the Royal Navy, the submariners mentioned by the Secretary, not least, of course, one submariner I will mention by name, former submariner, Fergal Dalton, who is, of course, the husband of the Honourable Lady for Glasgow North West, an Irishman who now serves as a Scottish National Party councillor in Glasgow. But, Mr Deputy Speaker, we send our best wishes to all of those who serve, and including those in the civilian staff, those in the Ministry of Defence Police as well. Our disagreement and our quarrel is not with them. Our quarrel is with the political decisions that are taken in this chamber. And, Mr Deputy Speaker, only in this House of Commons, at this time against the backdrop of a major constitutional crisis, where each day is worse than the last, could it be thought of as a good use of our time to backslap each other on the UK being 50 years as a marine nuclear power? Anyone who thinks that is a good use of our time right now, frankly, is off their head. But it should come as no surprise, perhaps, Mr Deputy Speaker. It should come as no surprise, Mr Deputy Speaker, as the Prime Minister is out in Brussels with the begging bowl right now, that particularly those on the benches that represent this crumbling relic of a government, and no doubt more to come from the Labour benches as well, they want to hark on to, I'll give way in time, that they want to hark on to these symbols of power, stature and glory as Britain's standing in the world is diminished by those on the government benches this afternoon. Indeed, Max Hastings, the military historian, put it best in the Times last year, Mr Deputy Speaker, when he said Trident renewal was a big willy gesture of a small willy nation. I couldn't have put it better if I had tried. And, Mr Deputy Speaker, opposition to the nuclear project by the Scottish National Party is well known and well documented. But given the opportunity this afternoon, I'll give way in time. Given the opportunity we have to discuss this afternoon, we will take the unusual step to divide the House this evening to show our opposition to the Trident renewal programme. And I do intend to set out three clear arguments as succinctly as possible as to why there is no military case for the continuous at-sea deterrent. There is certainly no economic case for the continuous at-sea deterrent, and indeed, Mr Deputy Speaker, how we can come to the conclusion, given the National Audit Office report from last week on the failure of this government and former Labour governments to properly decommission nuclear submarines, that the United Kingdom is now an irresponsible nuclear power. But I'll give way to the President of the NATO Parliamentary Assembly.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I just want to say, on behalf of the NATO alliance, the NATO nuclear alliance, that alliance greatly values the UK deterrence and would actually be grateful for the common sense, trust and belief in the UK's deterrence and our capacity and willingness to dedicate it to their stability and security. And they would actually be horrified by the honourable gentleman's comments earlier.
I should just point out to the Honourable Lady, who I have bucket loads of respect for, and she does a fine job in her position. Most members of NATO are not nuclear-armed countries. So instead, I'll give way to the honourable gentleman in time. But Mr Deputy Speaker, in opposing the renewal programme this afternoon, we do intend to give voice to the millions outside of this chamber who don't back the ironclad consensus that exists between that party and that party on wasting billions of pounds on nuclear weapons. Mr Deputy Speaker, on the fact that there is no military case, I want to turn to the recent modernising defence programme, which does represent a missed opportunity to do things a bit differently. I did have hopes that the much-vaunted reforming seal of the Secretary of State, when he did first come to office, would actually be shown to be true, but those hopes were sadly misplaced on my part. Indeed, the MDP programme, which did represent that opportunity to do things differently, has rather perversely actually contributed to the miasma of despair and chaos that hangs over the department that he now presides over. The armed forces remains as small as it was when Napoleon was on his horse. The government is woefully off target, set in its own manifesto in terms of the size of the armed forces, and indeed promises made to the people of Scotland in 2014 on the size of the armed forces are going one way and it's not north. Yet, staggeringly, Mr Deputy Speaker, this government continues to employ capita to... I will give way to the Honourable Gentleman. He doesn't need to keep shouting at me. I know he's there and I'm going to give way to him. I always do and he knows that. Yet, staggeringly, despite the recruitment problems we have, Mr Deputy Speaker, this government continues to spend millions of pounds on capita and their deeply flawed recruitment programme. I'll tell you, Mr Deputy Speaker, if a motion came to the House today to sack capita, I would be in the lobby with the right honourable gentleman for Raleigh and Wickford, who I know does have a track record in opposing capita. But I'll give way to the honourable gentleman, then I'll come back to you.
Great if the honourable gentleman way. And he said he's going to divide the House today to vote against this. I understand it's SNP policy to be a member of NATO. And he is right when he says that there are many nations that are not nuclear, do not possess nuclear weapons. But as a member of NATO, you have to actually agree to the nuclear doctrine and nuclear strategy and sit on the nuclear planning group. So is he saying that independent Scotland, if it joined NATO, would sometimes want to abrogate itself? Or is he actually advocating to vote against nuclear weapons today, but actually join a nuclear alliance?
Well, I say to the honourable gentleman, he doesn't need to explain Scottish National Party policy to me. Scottish National Party policy, perhaps if he listens I can educate him. Scottish National Party policy is for an independent Scotland to join NATO. Everyone knows, including him, that that would be accepted, by the way. But it's to join NATO on the contingency that Trident will be removed from Scotland's waters. That doesn't prevent the United Kingdom from continuing to have a nuclear at-sea deterrent, although we think it shouldn't, and it almost certainly wouldn't. They're coming at me from all sides here. He asked me a question. I'm not finished explaining myself to him. But the point is, Mr Deputy Speaker, that even if the UK gave up its nuclear weapons, tonight there would still be other nuclear states in the NATO alliance. That's not what I'm not going to get into this with them. But we are very clear that we do believe that the United Kingdom should give up its nuclear weapons because there is no economic, there is no military case, and it behaves now like an irresponsible nuclear power. But on capita, I'll take the honourable gentleman.
Well, you might get a buy one, get one free. Can I just say on the matter of capita, and I don't normally agree with the SNP, but I would definitely vote with him to sack capita tomorrow. They are a disgrace, and they are now so awful, they are a threat to the defence of the realm. But when it comes to our nuclear deterrent, he and I could not be more opposed, and I will always want to support the maintenance of nuclear defences in this country.
Well, I'm glad normal service has resumed, Mr Deputy Speaker. If I could make progress, I will give way to my honourable friend. But just on this issue of recruitment that he mentions, there is, of course, the other issue of retention, which is becoming a big problem in the armed forces. I know that he himself does recognise that. Indeed, we have a situation now, Mr Deputy Speaker, where we have members of the armed forces, and they told us this in the last Armed Forces Satisfaction Survey, where they are joining the armed forces or staying in the armed forces until such a time as they get a decent skill and qualification, with the sole intention of leaving to go into private industry. And that is what the last Armed Forces Survey tells us. I don't know why there's some honourable members in the Tory benches shaking their heads to that. But, Mr Speaker, as this government presses on with Trident renewal, we should, of course, cast our eyes back to a couple of the promises it did make to the people of Scotland in the 2014 referendum campaign as far as defence is concerned. Of course, a promise was made on a frigate factory on the Clyde. I'll come to the honourable gentleman later, if I might. A promise was made on a frigate factory on the Clyde. A promise that was broken not by this Secretary of State, but by the Speaker, who I'm sure is going to follow me, the former Secretary of State. And yet he seemed to think that there was a frigate factory on the Clyde. I recall, in fact, he seems to be maintaining that there is. And I recall him standing at the dispatch box declaring there was a frigate factory on the Clyde. No such thing exists. And then we come to the order of frigates. A promise was made by the former Prime Minister David Cameron of 13 frigates to be built on the Clyde. That was cut from 13 down to 8. So here we go. Any time you get a promise on defence and on shipbuilding from this Tory government, you can be guaranteed, a bit like the way the Fleet Solid Support Ship contract is being lined up at the minute, it will be another sellout from Westminster. I give way to my honourable friend.
For giving way. Does he also recall that when the former Secretary of State was at the dispatch box claiming there was a frigate factory, BBC Scotland were with a GMB official and the piece of land where the frigate factory was supposed to be, which was, of course, a landfill of ash?
Did recall that, Mr Deputy Speaker, and my honourable friend, the honourable member for Glasgow South West, does a fine job in representing his constituency shipbuilding workforce there. No, I won't. I'm going to move on to why. I'm going to move on to the issue of the threat, because the Shadow Secretary was right to say that the threat is ever-evolving. It is, of course, complex. The new SDSR... Sorry, I will give way to one of the friends.
I thank him for giving way. It's just the fact he mentioned the Shadow Secretary then, because it was unfortunate she refused to take any interventions. Now, her opening remarks were that Labour support the continuous at-sea deterrent. Does that not prove what we all know? That it doesn't matter what the Scottish branch office do with their pretend motions about being against Trident replacement. It's what the head office down here says, and they have to do what they're told.
Do you know, Mr Deputy Speaker, I'm going to come to the opposition, don't worry about that, but I'll say this to people who may disagree with the SNP, and as far as our policy on nuclear weapons goes, you at least know what it is you are getting. Opposition. What you get from Labour is a mess. It depends on whether it's a frontbencher, a backbencher, it depends if it's a Scottish MP or a non-Scottish MP, a member of the Scottish Parliament. You get a mess from Labour as far as nuclear weapons are concerned. Now, Mr Deputy Speaker, the new SDSR, which is surely being worked on right now, must reflect the threats that we do indeed face. And she was right to say that they come from a diverse range of state and non-state actors. And she did mention in her short speech the issue of hybrid security as well. And that is something that the government, in my view, does not understand as well as it could. And actually, it could learn quite a few lessons from our allies, particularly in the Baltic states. And of course, we have the issue of the government of Russia in particular continuously testing response times of the Royal Navy and of the RAF. And incursions are regular now into Scottish waters, Scottish airspace, and on that we do commend the RAF, particularly those based at Lossiemouth, for the work that they do in keeping us safe. But, Mr Deputy Speaker, both the Defence Select Committee and NATO itself has urged the government not to forget its own backyard in the High North and the North Atlantic. And indeed, when I sat in the Secretary of State's office in Main Building before the Modernising Defence Programme, that was central to what it was we asked the Modernising Defence Programme to focus on. And credit where it's due, a new focus has been given to the High North and the North Atlantic, and these benches at least welcome that. But, Mr Deputy Speaker, it is time for the UK Government to ditch this jingoism of global Britain. Indeed, the Centre for Eastern Studies itself, a think tank based in Poland, did state in a recent report on Brexit and its impact on the UK's security posture that this desire to be seen as a big global player actually could undermine its efforts to help protect the eastern NATO flank. In fact, given the State Secretary's own extraordinary speech that he made in February of this year, telling us how he was going to send personnel off to the South China Sea, saw China cancel a visit by the Chancellor of the Exchequer. So I say to the Government, it's time to focus on the bread and butter issues here at home and those highlighted by Neil. I will give way.
I thank the honourable member for giving way, and I've helpfully given him inadvertently advance notice of the issue over NATO. So let me take him back to it. He talks about the High North. He knows that is where much of the nuclear patrol activity from Russia is coming. If the SNP's case is that it is morally repugnant to have nuclear weapons, how is it morally defensible, therefore, then to maintain itself under the nuclear umbrella if those submarines are just sent a few hundred miles to the south? Surely it would be logical, actually, for the SNP to say it would withdraw from NATO's nuclear alliance.
No, it would not. Indeed, the two cases I have set out, the second of which I'm coming on to, is how there is no military or economic case. He knows, because I've said this to him before. Right. I'm not going to get into an argument about morality with them, because you never wrestle with chimney sweeps, Mr Deputy Speaker.
So, can we come through the church? I don't want to get it personalised. Stewart Malcolm.
Come to the economic case, Mr Deputy Speaker. It ought to be the case for sure, and on this I'm sure we do agree with others, that the Government carries out a threat analysis, and subsequent to that threat analysis, it gets in itself what it needs to meet that threat and to keep people safe. But we don't believe, quite simply, that Trident complements that effort. The total costs of Trident, from design to through-life support, run into the many, many billions of pounds, estimated by some as high as £200 billion. Now, what we do know for sure, Mr Deputy Speaker, is that the current renewal project is already woefully out of control. Indeed, over £1 billion of the £10 billion contingency that was set aside by the Ministry of Defence has already been tapped into, and of the extra £1 billion announced by the Chancellor, £400 million of that is exclusively for the renewal nuclear project. In fact, the House of Commons Library figures tell us in their most recent briefing that the £2.2 billion spent on maintaining the deterrent per year is roughly equivalent to £42 million each week. That's about the same, Mr Deputy Speaker, that we spend on income support, statutory maternity pay, carers allowance or winter fuel payments. And it is the case that all of this represents a drain on conventional defence, which has always been the priority of these benches. This is at the time when the Department itself has enormous funding gaps in its equipment plan, estimated by the National Audit Office to be well over £10 billion. Big gaps in the funding of the defence estate, draining money as though it were going out of fashion. And it comes, Mr Deputy Speaker, as the Ministry of Defence continues with this bizarre fetish of privatisation and outsourcing of things that don't need to be privatised and don't need to be outsourced. The Ministry of Defence Fire and Rescue Service, the War Pension Scheme, the Armed Forces Compensation Scheme, even the Medals Office, Mr Deputy Speaker. These things must remain in the hands of the MOD in their entirety. And in the Armed Forces itself, it's not uncommon to have serving members having to buy substitute kit because the money isn't there to get it through the department's budget. So far from enhancing our national security and necessary capability to keep us safe, Trident is a drain on conventional defence, particularly, Mr Deputy Speaker, as the Government keeps it part of the overall defence budget, to the point that it diminishes our conventional defence and security posture, which is in need of proper investment and proper oversight. And on the last point, Mr Deputy Speaker, it can be concluded that this country is now an irresponsible nuclear power. The timing of this debate could not be more breathtaking if it had tried. As we sit here today to mark 50 years as a maritime nuclear power, just last week the National Audit told us that hundreds of millions of pounds are being wasted by this government on storing obsolete nuclear submarines, and its utter failure to decommission them properly and responsibly, to the point that the independent NEO, this isn't me, the independent NEO said that it does put the UK's reputation as a responsible nuclear power at risk. The MOD hasn't decommissioned a single submarine successfully since 1980. Twice as many are currently in storage as there are in service. 9 still contain radioactive fuel. 7 have been in storage for longer than they were in service. No submarines have been defuelled in the last 15 years. A total failure and liability costs estimated by the Secretary's own department run up to £7.5 billion. And you can be sure, as night follows day, Mr Deputy Speaker, that figure will get higher. Now, auditors did say, I'll finish this point, auditors did say, they said that the MOD did not have a fully developed plan to dispose of operational Vanguard and Astute submarines or its future Dreadnought-class vessels, which have different nuclear reactors. So here the House sits with the ironclad consensus that we must renew a programme, a nuclear submarine programme, that it doesn't even have the plans to decommission in the future, even though the National Audit Office has just outlined what a costly farce that has become. And on that, Mr Deputy Speaker, this cannot just be shrugged off as though it's business as usual. The public expect us to get to the bottom of this. And I would ask the Secretary or his Minister, in summing up, if they will set up a public inquiry into the farce of nuclear submarine decommissioning. I'll give way.
The honourable gentleman for giving way, and he will know that his colleague and I and the honourable member for Plymouth are working with the department to make progress on this matter. I asked, would he and the SNP support us? Because what we need is to find the line of credit for nuclear decommissioning, which is an enormous one across the board, despite the SNP's position, to make sure that we can actually make progress with, rather than bashing the government on a question which is a long and historic one, to help us move forward and get the Treasury to support that decommissioning line.
Order. I'm sure the honourable lady wants to catch my eye to speak, and I don't want her to use the speech up just yet. I am bothered with 19 speakers. It's going to be less than 10 minutes each now. Stewart,
Mr Speaker, the short answer to the honourable lady's question is yes. But I will conclude, Mr Speaker, because I'm conscious of the time. There is certainly nothing to celebrate here in 50 years as a maritime nuclear power. Wrapped up in British jingoism, no doubt the rest of this debate will be. I'm not sure anything could convince the Conservatives to abandon the nuclear programme. But I am at a loss, Mr Deputy Speaker, as to why the Leader of the Opposition allows his party to be locked into it. There were times, Mr Deputy Speaker, where he would have spoken in this debate. He would have been on this side of the House. He would have been in the voting lobbies with us at the end of the debate if there had been a division. And he would have found himself there with members of the Scottish National Party. That he has abandoned that honourable principle and has not even tried to move his party's position on nuclear weapons remains a disappointment to millions and a mystery to me. So it's left to the Scottish National Party to give voice to those who oppose the militarily and economically illiterate case that the government has put forward, supported by the front bench of the Labour of the Opposition. It's left to the Scottish National Party to urge the government to sign up to the nuclear ban treaty. It's left to the Scottish National Party to make the case for sound conventional defence that protects us at home and does ensure we can do the job that needs to be done with our allies abroad. And it is left, Mr Deputy Speaker, to the Scottish National Party to say with one voice in this House, let us please stop this madness.
To help everybody to get in, can we use up to 10 minutes and no more? Sir Michael Fallon.